It started on an ordinary Thursday morning. My front gate was quiet, my driveway empty, until a bright red SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of my property. Out jumped Karen, clipboard in hand, the same HOA Karen I'd seen over the past few months, trying to micromanage my property. But this time, she wasn't here to talk about a fence or a noise complaint. No, this was bigger. She marched up to my door, flapping papers, pointing at the ground, shouting something about trespassing, violations, and, "You have 24 hours to vacate." Her voice carried that smug tone that only someone completely convinced of their own authority could muster. She even claimed she'd called 911. Yes, the HOA had apparently decided that calling the police to evict a private citizen was a reasonable tactic. I stayed calm. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I knew exactly what she didn't. My legal authority went beyond HOA bylaws. While she relied on threats, paperwork, and intimidation, I carried a badge, a real one, issued by my department, fully authorized, fully legal. And the truth was simple. She had no jurisdiction here.
None.
Karen pounded on my door again, stomping her feet for dramatic effect. I could hear her muttering about abuse of property and community safety. It was almost comical if it weren't so dangerous. The neighbors were peeking out their windows, whispering to each other. Some recognized her, some didn't, but everyone could tell this was about to explode. I opened the door slowly, badge in hand, and introduced myself officially. I am the property owner and a law enforcement officer. You are on private property, without permission. Her face shifted.
Surprise. Confusion.
Then anger. She tried to argue, waving her clipboard, claiming that the HOA gave her enforcement authority over residents. I stopped her mid-sentence. No HOA, no matter how entitled, can override your rights as a property owner. And you certainly cannot order a citizen to vacate private property by threatening law enforcement if you don't hold legal authority. At that moment, she realized something critical. Her call to 911 wasn't going to help her. I could verify everything with my badge. Every piece of paper she held was meaningless if challenged legally. I gave her one final warning. You need to leave immediately, or I will treat this as trespassing. She froze. Her clipboard trembled in her hands. And then, she tried one last desperate tactic, reaching for her phone to escalate. That's when I made my move, not violent but perfectly legal. I restrained the situation, confirmed her trespass, and initiated the arrest protocol using my badge authority. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as the entitled HOA Karen realized, for the first time, that threats without authority are worthless. And just like that, the tables flipped completely. She went from aggressor to the one being held accountable. The moment I escorted Karen off my property, the reality of the situation started to sink in, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Neighbors had come out of their homes, smartphones in hand, some filming, some just observing. They were witnessing a scenario no HOA drama manual could prepare them for, an entitled HOA officer being removed from a property she had no right to enforce. I documented everything carefully. Photos of her vehicle, timestamps of her arrival, her multiple attempts to approach the cabin, all evidence of trespassing and intimidation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting my rights and proving authority. And I knew this evidence would be crucial in case the HOA tried to escalate. But Karen wasn't done. She stormed back to her SUV and called someone, probably the HOA president, maybe even 911 again, trying to spin the story as the resident attacked me or I was enforcing community rules. I stayed calm. I knew the protocols. I logged every detail in my official report: date, time, location, nature of the encounter, her statements, and my response. By the afternoon, the HOA president showed up in person, furious, demanding explanations. They assumed intimidation and paperwork would make me comply. They didn't realize that a badge, training, and knowledge of my legal authority outweighed their assumptions. I met them at the gate, calmly explaining, the HOA has no legal enforcement powers on private property. Your threats, notices, and attempted calls to law enforcement don't grant you authority. Trespassing is a violation, and you've been warned. He tried to argue about bylaws, about community safety, about precedent. I countered with citations from local property law and HOA limits. Every point they tried to raise had already been neutralized by facts. Meanwhile, word spread. Neighbors started asking questions. Who had the authority? Why was Karen trespassing? Why did 911 even get involved? By evening, the HOA's credibility was crumbling faster than any angry email could repair it. People realized that authority isn't what you claim, it's what's legally backed. Then came the real test. Karen returned, trying to rally support from other HOA members. I didn't confront her directly this time. Instead, I locked down access to sensitive areas, verified all property boundaries, and sent a concise notice to the HOA. Any further attempts to enforce rules on this property without authorization will be considered trespassing. Law enforcement will be notified immediately. By sunset, the HOA was in disarray. Their rules held no weight. The neighbors who had once followed Karen's suggestions now whispered about accountability. Even the HOA attorney started calling, trying to negotiate a way to save face without exposing their officials to liability. The real victory wasn't physical, it was procedural and psychological. Karen could scream, threaten, and call 911, but none of it mattered. Legal authority, preparation, and calm execution had flipped the power dynamic completely. By the end of Section 2, it was clear. The HOA had no leverage. Karen's intimidation had failed, and the property and my rights remained fully protected. After the initial confrontation, the HOA tried a different approach, this time subtler, almost bureaucratic. They sent letters to the neighbors claiming that a dispute over community compliance was underway and that residents should remain aware and cautious. The language was careful, but the goal was obvious: make it look like I was the problem. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I focused on documentation. Every call, every message, every attempt to involve law enforcement was logged. I organized copies of property deeds, permits, and local municipal codes confirming my full rights over the property. By the time the HOA attorney finally reached out, I had a fully prepared legal packet ready. The attorney called cautiously, trying to sound professional. "We'd like to discuss how we can resolve this situation amicably," he said. I listened, letting him talk first. Then I calmly outlined the facts. The property is privately owned, HOA rules do not apply here, and any further attempts to enforce authority could be considered harassment. The negotiation was tense, but I stayed calm. My authority wasn't just in words. It was documented, legally undeniable, and enforceable. I made it clear. If the HOA wanted access to any part of my property, it would only be under my terms, in writing, and with explicit consent. That was the turning point. The HOA realized that threats, intimidation, and 911 calls wouldn't work. Their legal team began drafting compromises, trying to appease homeowners while quietly acknowledging that Karen and the board had overstepped. Their tone had shifted from confident to cautious. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began paying attention. Residents started asking questions, noticing discrepancies between HOA statements and reality. Some had even seen Karen confronted by law enforcement and realized the HOA hadn't been acting legally. Rumors spread. The HOA didn't own authority they claimed, and their enforcement tactics could backfire. During this period, I also reinforced the property physically. Access points were clearly marked, gates were secured, and signage was installed, stating, "Private property, authorized access only. No threats, no aggression, just clarity." The visual reminder, backed by documentation, made it impossible for HOA members to claim misunderstanding. Then came the subtle escalation. Karen and a few board members began asking for permission to hold events near the property. I set clear boundaries: permitted hours, maximum capacity, and required written approval. Every attempt to negotiate authority was under my terms. By the time Section 3 ended, the HOA was no longer in control. Karen, once brazen and threatening, had become cautious and measured. Residents were aware of the legal reality, and my property, my cabin, was fully protected. The balance of power had shifted completely. Intimidation had failed, documentation had prevailed, and the HOA now had to operate within limits I set. Once the HOA realized that Karen's threats and 911 calls were ineffective, they started a behind-the-scenes scramble. Board meetings grew tense, and emails circulated rapidly, some apologetic, some defensive. But the truth was clear. Their authority had no legal footing, and every attempt to reclaim control risked escalating the situation further. I stayed completely silent in public, letting the HOA dig its own hole. I didn't confront them online or talk to neighbors unnecessarily. I only acted through legal and procedural channels. Every trespass attempt was documented, every call logged, every unauthorized approach photographed. By remaining calm and methodical, I allowed their missteps to speak for themselves. The HOA attorney kept reaching out, trying to negotiate a compromise. I reviewed every draft carefully, making adjustments only to protect my property and reinforce boundaries. I demanded clear, written recognition that the HOA had no enforcement power over my cabin, driveway, or surrounding land. Without it, no agreement would be valid. Meanwhile, Karen tried to spin stories to the neighborhood, claiming she was acting in good faith and that I had somehow overreacted. But the residents had already seen the events unfold firsthand. Witnesses knew the truth, and her credibility began crumbling. A few even approached me privately, apologizing for believing her threats and expressing relief that I'd acted decisively. To solidify control, I installed clearly visible signs at key access points. Private property, no unauthorized entry. Simple.
Clear.
Legally reinforced. The signs weren't aggressive. They were preventative. And they worked. No further unauthorized attempts were made to approach the cabin. By midweek, the HOA was in full damage control mode. Board members quietly resigned, and the president attempted to distance herself from Karen's actions. Notices were sent out to residents, vaguely referencing a property dispute resolved, but without clarifying details. The HOA's aura of authority had collapsed. Even the legal threats lost their teeth. With documentation, witnesses, and my own law enforcement credentials, any further attempt to challenge me would have exposed them to liability. They had no leverage left, and their fear of legal consequences was palpable. Finally, the community started realizing a bigger picture. The HOA had misrepresented authority for years, and any attempt to overstep boundaries would now be met with proof, procedure, and consequences. Karen's actions, once intimidating, had become a cautionary tale, an example of entitlement failing against preparation, law, and calm assertiveness. By the end of Section 4, the situation was completely under control. The HOA could no longer dictate terms. Karen had lost credibility, and my cabin and the surrounding property was secure. What remained was to finalize boundaries, legal agreements, and ensure no future attempts could challenge ownership. With the HOA's threats neutralized and Karen's credibility shattered, it was time to secure long-term peace. I drafted a formal property agreement clearly outlining all boundaries, rules for access, if any, and explicit consequences for unauthorized entry. Everything was recorded with the county, legally binding and impossible to dispute.
I didn't stop there.
Every access point was clearly marked with official signage, emphasizing that the property was private and that any unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing. There was no intimidation, no shouting, just clarity, backed by law. This alone deterred further attempts at harassment. Interestingly, the HOA tried one last move, a discussion with the neighbors about community relations. I declined to participate. I didn't need to negotiate social approval or sway opinions. My rights were clear, documented, and enforceable. The HOA's influence over my property was gone, and their board members, fearful of further legal exposure, quickly accepted that fact. Karen, who once strutted around like she controlled the area, now avoided the cabin entirely. I didn't gloat, but her avoidance sent a clear message. Authority based on entitlement collapses when faced with legality and preparation. Word spread through the neighborhood. Residents learned that the HOA couldn't simply claim control over private property and that intimidation without authority has consequences. Life slowly returned to normal. Mornings were quiet again, the dock untouched, the cabin peaceful. I resumed everyday routines, coffee on the porch, fishing at sunrise, and enjoying the privacy I had fought to protect. Every interaction now felt safe because boundaries were clear and enforceable. In the end, the lesson was simple but powerful. Authority is nothing without legitimacy. The HOA's bylaws, notices, and calls to 911 were meaningless against documented ownership and calm, lawful enforcement. Entitlement can intimidate in the moment, but preparation, clarity, and adherence to the law always prevail. Even months later, I received occasional messages from neighbors, not about HOA drama, but about fishing, the lake, and shared admiration for how the situation was handled. It confirmed what I had learned firsthand. Power rooted in truth is far stronger than power rooted in threats. The cabin, the lake, and the surrounding property remain mine, peaceful, secure, and free from HOA interference. Karen and her board learned their lesson the hard way, and the neighborhood now understands that real authority is earned, documented, and respected, not assumed. And with that, the ordeal ended. Not with a fight, but with clear boundaries, law, and patience.